Hello, I'm Luke,
Hi, it's Michael.
and this is our podcast.
So today, in light of Trump's recent controversial topics about Andrew Jackson being useful, I guess, if he was in the Civil War era instead of back in 1820, we're going to talk about the Civil War. And we're going to talk about, the leading people in it, Lincoln, generals, everything. We're going to talk about the war. Because, there seems to be this big controversy about it, depending on where you're from geographically. And I think us being from Arizona, we kind of get a little bit, a mix of it. Because, Phoenix, where we're from, is very, metropolitan, more West Coast. But, everything around us here is kind of very country. So, I think it'll be a fun topic. I can't wait to start. So, what's your opinion on it?
Okay, so I'm actually just going to pull up the whole Andrew Jackson quote real quick.
Okay, sure.
But in the meantime, let's just talk about what, let's just paraphrase a bit. Trump said, let's just start with this. He said, how did the Civil War happen? That's a lot of people on Twitter were lambasting him for that. A lot of people said, well, obviously it's because of slavery. So I think we should first talk about that aspect of it while I'm getting up the quote.
Sure. So I think the quote that applies perfectly to this is something, a brilliant military mind, Prussian military mind, Clausewitz said. And he said, war is a mere continuation of politics by other means.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly what you see with the Civil War. We see a breakdown of politics. The past 50 years, there's been, the tensions were ratcheting up between the North and the South over slavery, over economics, like tariffs, which, is part of the slavery question. But there's a big economic question. Then there's also the expansionhood of new states and the conflicts over that, because there's kind of the southern and northern bloc just voting on every issue, and so every state wanted to try to keep it balanced, or they're afraid the North was going to get ahead, or they're afraid the South was going to get too much power and slavery was never going to go away. So a lot of it was just a breakdown of not being able to settle the matter in Congress and not being able to settle it really in any way, and so it broke down and led to war. So I think that's the biggest thing that people don't understand, is that, war isn't just an independent thing. It's not an isolated act. It's not something that just happens due to a reactionary sentiment. That's very rarely what happens, and especially with the Civil War. So I think that's the first thing people need to establish. Yes, slavery, I do think, is the main force behind the Civil War.
Yeah.
There's slavery, but I think it's also important to know that slavery is not more than just the institution itself. There's so much more attached to it. There's so many other factors around it that go beyond just slavery and the morality of slavery, I guess. And I think people kind of oversimplify it with that. But we'll get into that.
Uh-huh.
Do you have the quote exactly?
Yeah. So his quote regarding the why why was there a Civil War? It's people don't ask that question, but why was there a Civil War? Why could that one not have been worked out? So I think we need to talk about, I guess we should go over kind of what efforts were made to try and prevent a Civil War.
Sure.
Henry Clay came in a lot.
Yeah, Henry Clay, he's probably my favorite American politician of all time. It's definitely something we need in the gridlocked Congress today. Somebody who can compromise, cross those party lines. He was really meant for it. He was from Kentucky, so he's from the border state. He even made kind of his own party when he founded the Whigs. And, he kind of had some stances that were like the North and some stances that were like the South. And especially in slavery, he was pretty impartial. With the Missouri Compromise and the 1850 Compromise, those are... people criticize parts of them, like the Fugitive Slave Act. People, a lot of people like to criticize them, and they weren't perfect. But going back to what I was just saying, that war is just a mere continuation of politics by other means. It makes sense. He's trying to use politics and trying to pass policies that can at least push back and at least perhaps delay and get rid of the chance of a war. And so I think he did that well. Then he died in 1852, obviously, so he couldn't be there for when the war starts in 1861. But I think he is key. But I think it's important to understand that Douglas and Lincoln, I think, are a big part of this. Their debates that like were very highly publicized, very highly talked about. Those got a lot of national attention, even though they were only held in Illinois. And I also think it comes down to northern versus southern, just where you're from. Yeah. And I think that was the biggest factor that led to the Civil War. Mm-hmm. I think that if we saw a southerner get elected somehow, which wasn't possible just due to the way electoral politics works, and it was so divided. I mean, if you look at that electoral map, it's crazy to see. Like, basically, it was the South voted for the Southern candidate, and the border states like Kentucky, Missouri, West Virginia. I mean, this is before West Virginia existed.
So Virginia, I suppose.
Virginia didn't vote that, but anyway, the border states voted for the border state candidate, basically. I guess a successor to Clay, but not as important personally. And then all of the North voted for Lincoln, and then due just to sheer population, which is something people complain about now today with the Electoral College about Trump getting elected. They hated that because they thought it wasn't fair because he didn't win the popular vote. I'm pretty sure Lincoln did still win the popular vote, but anyway, I mean that was that put it all down to the Northern candidate winning. That was the final mark, I guess. That's what set them off. It wasn't so much Lincoln didn't say himself any policy that he wanted to get rid of slavery. That was never his goal. He even stated that he intended to leave it alone. He didn't want it to go into the western states at all, into the new states, but he didn't want to extend slavery. And then, if a Southerner won, he probably would have tried to push really hard for slavery into the New Mexico territory. And that probably would have set the Northerners off. Who knows? We could have had some sort of rebellion in the North, or at least just a small scale, some small scale revolts by individuals and causing chaos and who knows what.
Yeah, there'd probably be a lot more John Browns.
Exactly. Yes, there probably would have been. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm sort of the same way. It seems like at that point it was almost inevitable for a civil war or something to happen. But as far as Trump's comments, I feel they're purposely misunderstood. They're meant to be put in a certain light. Once again, I'm biased towards Trump, so keep that in mind. But when someone says why was there a civil war, especially when he said why could that not have been worked out, he's got a point there. Maybe something could have been done. Maybe if Henry Clay had lived on a bit longer.
Or somebody had taken on
Yeah, someone had taken his place.
I completely agree. I have to, just with hindsight, I have to look back at this whole Sean Spicer thing about the Holocaust comments.
Yeah. And
I do think some people took unfairly worded, taken sound bites from what he said. Watching the whole clip of what he said, he sounded pretty ignorant, calling
Holocaust centers,
concentration camps, Holocaust centers. I can't expect you to understand the military logistics and what weapons the Nazi regime used in the Wehrmacht
against soldiers, of course.
I know, but I can't understand him to have that detailed historical knowledge if he calls concentration camps Holocaust centers.
Yeah,
that's why he kind of loses his credibility in me trying to look at when I look at that. Trump, I have to say, he's made some kind of when he talks about history, some comments that make him seem pretty ignorant about it. I don't know. I've heard reports that Bannon really likes Andrew Jackson, and some people hypothesize that potentially Bannon has talked to Trump a lot about how much he likes Andrew Jackson, maybe compared him or something when they're talking. So maybe that's why he kind of just started going on this tangent about how much he liked Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
There's that. I don't know if he really knows he's read something Andrew Jackson did, or he knows about historical things that maybe if Jackson had tried to do that. About Jackson, Jackson did shut down a secessionist movement started by Calhoun in South Carolina, which is the first time. Well, there was the Hartford Convention too in the North,
right?
But But this was the first like Southern secession movement that was kind of based still on this topic. And Jackson just rolled in with the federal army and said, you better stand down and you better stop this because we're coming for you. And and that was enough. And I mean, he was a Southerner, Tennessee. So no, I'm not going to say the candidate who was opposing Lincoln, Breckinridge. I'm not going to say he would have been Andrew Jackson. So I'm not saying like if a Southerner had been elected instead of Lincoln, we wouldn't have had the Civil War, because I still think there would have been. It would have, if it didn't happen then, it would have happened in another 4 years when they voted in a Northerner, because the North is so upset by the Southern president.
Right.
So I think that's the thing. I mean, Andrew that does beg the question though. We do need to talk about if Andrew Jackson was, let's say, born like 20 years later or something, and then he reaches the presidency. I guess he fought in like the Mexican War or something instead of at the Battle of New Orleans at 1812. I mean, so just so it keeps his historical persona.
Yeah, and just so you know where we're coming from, Trump does talk about Andrew Jackson a lot in this interview, where he also talked about the Civil War.
Okay.
And he said, Trump's exact words were, I mean, had Andrew Jackson been a little later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart, and he was very angry. And he saw that what was happening with regard to the Civil War. I think he meant he was referring to he sees the split between North and South. He said, there's no reason for this. People don't realize, the Civil War, you think about it, why? And then there's the whole quote about why was there even a Civil War? So that's just why we're getting to him. And that's why we think it's important to talk about.
Yeah.
But anyways, please.
Yeah. So we're trying to put Jackson in here. Let's say Jackson, I guess. I mean, I don't know if he. Sure. Let's say Jackson was running for election at Lincoln against Lincoln.
Sure. Yeah.
He was the Southern candidate, I guess.
Southern-ish, I guess, border state.
I mean, Tennessee's more just Southern. But I mean, it's more than this. It's not deep South, but.
Oh yeah, I was thinking of Clay. My mistake.
But yeah, so if you had Andrew Jackson running, I feel like at the climate it doesn't matter how he was Old Hickory and he fought in the war and he was impressive general and he had a nice persona, that really rallied people. I don't think that would have mattered, because I don't really see him working out if he's running against Lincoln. I think that the North will just think he's a Southerner. They'll reject him. They'll have their own issues. And I also still think that no one in the North would have voted for him either. They would have been like, he's a Southerner. We have so many issues on the line right now. We can't afford to vote for a Southerner, even if this guy seems like he's not super radical about slavery. He still owned slaves. He had a plantation, Hermitage, So I definitely don't think he would have won even. If he ran, I still think Lincoln would have won.
Yeah, I think the odds were too stacked in Lincoln's favor. Not saying necessarily that that's bad. It's just how it was.
Yeah, no, that exactly. That's just how it was electorally. It's just the way it is. Though I do think if somehow he had been elected instead of Buchanan, president before Lincoln, I do think that he could have potentially had the Henry Clay in him, or of course he's not a Henry Clay compromiser, but I think he would have carried on the efforts of Clay. I think he would have, maybe in a more aggressive manner, but I think he would have tried to keep the compromise between the two groups somehow. I'm really convinced that if I do agree, I guess, with Trump's idea that if Jackson had come later, he may have been more useful, I guess. I mean, he definitely revolutionized democracy in the U.S., made it much more direct. He started kind of a whole system of if you help me in the campaign, I'll help you once I'm in office. He really did revolutionize the democracy, the democratic element, in good and bad ways.
Yeah.
But and I do think he would have helped to keep the country together. I mean, I don't know. Based off of it's totally speculation. So it's really hard to say, and it's we have to look at what his record is, and he already tried to stop the secession of South Carolina. So when Buchanan's sitting around watching all these states secede, forming a Confederate Congress and stuff, and talking about this, there's no way you could believe that Jackson would have just been sitting there letting it all go by. So I guess that's the one thing you can kind of, just using the precedent of what he did during his term.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't see him allowing what happened with Buchanan. But I do think if he ran against Lincoln, so if we're really going to replace Lincoln with him, I don't think that would work out.
Just out of curiosity, do you remember which state was the first to secede, or did they just like all secede at once?
Oh no, they seceded over time. The first few states were like,
let me. Look
I'm
that
pretty
up.
sure like Alabama, Florida. It was more of the deep South. The last state to secede, I do know, was Virginia, which a lot of people would be surprised by because that was the capital.
Oh, and this is actually kind of interesting. The first state to secede was South Carolina.
That's
and I think,
there we go.
Geez,
Yeah.
it'd be like a repetition of history
Yeah,
almost.
it was the deeper South states that started seceding. But yeah, there you go. I mean, he would have definitely stopped that. Again, I mean, we already know.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, when it happened back with, stipulate that, like, when the secession movement happened with Calhoun, it was kind of South Carolina with the whole nullification theory. That's what he was touting. And, that was just like a kind of like infantile stage of like the secessionist movement that you see like in 1860. But I think he would have been combating that force with all of his might, Jackson. I think he would have made it a number one priority, and he would have been very aggressive in pursuing his goals. So still stand by that.
Yeah, I agree. Just looking at this date right here, it says South Carolina seceded in December 20th, 1860, and the second one to secede was Mississippi in January 9th.
There you go, yeah.
But, that's practically 3 weeks apart. And, I think, and how long did it take him to stop Calhoun from seceding with South Carolina? Like, it must have taken at least a week.
Yeah, I mean,
like he would have been there with soldiers with guns and said, "No, stop this now. I'm going to use this," and they'd have no choice because none of the other states would be there, and they aren't
they're
prepared.
not organized. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so I totally think that if that would have happened, then he would have definitely come down and smashed them hard.
But if there is one thing that of Jackson's persona, of what Jackson believed that was there when the Civil War happened, it was with the generals.
Okay.
I mean, on both sides, I think. But on both sides, they all didn't want to see the war. Whether you're talking about like Winfield Scott, who at this point is just old, pretty much an advisor, but he still proved to be probably the best general in the war, at least.
The idea of the
his
Anaconda
plan, which they refused to implement, all of these generals that thought they knew better. But anyway, I mean, all of these guys, all pretty much were opposed to the war. I mean, most of them, had knew like their Union colleague generals. They were friends with them. They didn't really understand why they're fighting. A lot of them hated the idea that the country they had fought and expanded for against Mexico was being split in half. Because, I mean, it's just geopolitically, it's just disadvantageous for both the South and the North to not be together. Because that just means that Europe has, better odds than against a future United States. I mean, look at, even I think it was Disraeli, the later British Prime Minister in the 19th century, actually had said that, I almost wish that we had intervened early and helped the Confederacy out because they were definitely afraid that the U.S., not Germany, was going to be their big rival on the sea because of just the ability and the fact that they were ratcheting up their industrialization, and they thought they were going to have, and they were building ships. They were going to have they thought they were going to have a massive navy on both of their coasts, and it was going to be a really big competitor with them. They didn't think that Germany unified so late. They didn't expect Germany to be that threat. They thought it was going to be the U.S. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it like that. So, going back to the point, like, these generals didn't want to divide the U.S. They thought that it was dumb to split up the federal government.
Right.
And then, additionally, I mean, each general was different. But, some of them weren't slaveholders on the southern side. We'll talk about the southern side first, yeah. Some of them weren't slaveholders. Some of them were, and they didn't support slavery, and they wanted it to end. I mean, Lee was a slaveholder, got rid of his slaves shortly before the war, and hated the institution of slavery, and probably, if the Confederacy had won, would have been a leading guy to force them to outlaw it.
An abolitionist in the South.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call him an abolitionist, I guess, because like that involves some sort of like joining the movement.
Oh, sure,
but
like
a lot of them weren't abolitionists, but they weren't fighting for slavery. Like PGT Beauregard, the guy who commanded the attack on Fort Sumter, which officially started the war, and also led the first Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, whichever way you want to call it. He was French. He was aristocratic. He had never even had to speak English till he went to West Point. He lived in Louisiana, and yes, he did live on a plantation, but he thought slavery was useless. He didn't think it was the way of the future. Thought it was a little like uncouth. Didn't think it was very civilized. And I mean, of course, these are weak words to talk about something that's so like horrible.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say that like the fact that they don't think it's morally important really to get rid of slavery. That's obviously a negative. But, I mean, it does mean something that they weren't writing and shouting about how much they love slavery, how important slavery was to them. Mm-hmm. Like, because these are the wars after a hero, especially the people that win an independence war. Those are the people that people look to afterwards and to lead the government.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, like pretty much like Washington, of course, was the first president. And then you had John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Monroe, Madison.
Exactly.
These are the founding fathers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, while those guys weren't all military, they were all involved very deeply into the process. And everybody knew who they were during the process of getting independent. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, like Johnston, who was the other commanding general with Lee, didn't want anything to do with slavery. And, even towards the end of the war, they started shifting. I mean, a lot of that's because of the fact they were losing and there's a lot of problems. But they started ending slavery because they weren't able to economically support slaves anymore. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, as negative as that is, that
reason.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know. The point is that these guys were fighting for more of some sense of honor, something that we think is kind of ridiculous to talk about today, I guess, because nobody really thinks about our generals or even our soldiers for the most part.
Yeah.
We don't use the term honor to describe what they're doing today in Afghanistan or what we did in Iraq. That's not really a concept.
Yeah, it's more like bravery or courage.
Yeah, and it's more
something.
Yeah,
but not honor.
And while that's all those are also involved here, it's this is more a lot of these guys thought, and this is negative in itself, but a lot of these guys thought that they had to fight for their state, like Louisiana for Beauregard or Virginia for Lee, because they thought, I don't agree with the policies that my state's doing. I don't agree with slavery necessarily. And I don't even agree with splitting up the Union. But this is my home state. This is my from, and if I want to hold my honor to my family and the people I know here, then I have to fight with my state. So I have to do what my state does. And that might sound ridiculous. You might say that's stupid. But we say the same thing today. I mean, we tell our soldiers, if you don't agree with the policy of whoever's president, if Trump invades North Korea tomorrow and you're a soldier, you can't just quit or say you don't want to. I mean, you can't just even if if we start a draft or something, you're not allowed to just reject it because you don't agree with the policy.
Right.
You're supposed to embrace it and fight for the country, and that's your state. Just because, and so I think it's a very similar concept to that. I think people kind of overlook that, how important that is, because it's still an important thing today. We just don't think about it the same exact way.
Yeah. And, you brought up the whole, I need to do this for my state thing. That's really reminiscent of, a story I was told about Lee. And, he's from Virginia, which is, one of the, which was, I guess, not technically a border state, but kind of close. It's the most far north of the South, I suppose. But when when the Union called to him and said, "Hey, we'd like you to lead our soldiers against the Confederacy," and I think there were stories of him literally pacing back and forth for like 12 hours in his house before he finally said, "Look, I don't support what's going on with the CSA, Confederate States of America, but it's I'm from Virginia. It's my home state. I'm going to fight for them, even though I don't necessarily agree with it." And that kind of ties it back to your whole like thing of honor. So like, oh, shouldn't hit the table so hard, pardon me. But yeah, I think that was an apt point, just saying something like that.
Yeah, and I mean that, like you're talking about, that was Winfield Scott too. Like probably, I would say probably the most decorated, most honored general in U.S. history. Wellington, actually, the British general who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. He actually, after the end of the Mexican War, said Winfield Scott was like a mirror of himself. He thought Winfield Scott was one of the best generals in the world, and that's coming from the guy who defeated Napoleon. So
yeah.
I mean, you're rejecting that guy who's asking you to like follow him, and you worked with him closely. You and him worked very closely together in the Mexican War. So I mean, I think a lot of people think oh, and if he's not motivated by slavery, if he got rid of slavery, he calls slavery bad, then there has to be some like other motive that he has, and you know what I mean? Like he's not just fighting for slavery. I do have to say though, so when we look at slavery, when we look at Lincoln,
yes,
I think we need to talk about Lincoln.
Yeah, certainly. He is probably he's the most recognized figure of the Civil War. He's
absolutely,
yeah, and certainly, and yeah. So I guess we should talk about him. More importantly, how was he as a president? Was he overrated? Did he do a good job? You obviously know more about this than I do. So why don't you start?
I mean, I think though we do have to let's just think about it let's think about it on a simple level, kind of like Trump was saying. So we have to think. We know the qualities of Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, right? Tough, was a general himself, aggressive. So I think what Trump's essentially saying is that's what we needed to stop the Civil War. I would even argue, and I don't even know, maybe Trump would agree with this, who knows. I think that's what we needed, the North needed, that's what we needed in the Civil War. And I think for a lot of reasons. First of all, I think the war lasted way too long. Shouldn't have had to last that long. And because it lasted so long, that's why we have such the divide between the North and the South still today, and that's why there's so much hatred between the black people and the Southerners today, and why it was even worse after the war back then. I think that's a lot of that is attributed to the length and the process and the grueling, slow, violent, destructive nature of how the North had dealt with the South, and I don't think it had to be that bad.
Okay. You were talking before about how even if the Confederate States did win and they became independent, I think we both kind of agree that there would have eventually been an abolitionist movement. Probably they would have gotten rid of slavery at some point, because like you said, especially the people who seem to be more well off, the generals or some of the statesmen, even they were against slavery, not just
if they weren't against slavery, it doesn't that. I think the point is as long as they aren't so. Some of them were definitely obsessed with slavery. I don't think we can.
Yeah, I'm not going to say
you can look at the
were.
Statements of the states when they secede, and almost all of them. There's Mississippi and Texas. They all say the North is trying to violate our rights, trying to strip us of our African slaves, which is ours. God determined that, and they try to use that type of language. So it's definitely a major part. I don't want to undermine that, but I think any reasonable country trying to compete, first of all, with a northern neighbor, if it became independent, they would have to industrialize. And if they industrialize, that's the end of slavery, because it's just not economically wise to have a slave economy working in an industrial center. I mean, look at Karl Marx's writings. He even understands the evolution of like serfdom into the current like bourgeoisie proletariat dynamic. He
Right.
talks about that like that a cost like the bourgeoisie is just an even better form of feudalism for them, because they can pay people less, can give them horrible working conditions, and then never give them any shelter or food.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very expendable because there's tons of poor people.
Yeah. So basically, you got rid of the costs of keeping
exactly.
workers.
So you get rid of the costs, and then you industrialize. It's just what they had to do. So if they became independent, they were forced to industrialize. So I think in about 10 years, if they had won, slavery would have been gone. No, I think the racism still would have been there, but I think it would have been very diminished, at least compared to the levels it was at when the KKK is going around lynching entire black communities and stuff like that, and they couldn't get any jobs, and it was just horrible. It was a total mess. I mean, they would probably get abused industrially, but not any more so than, I guess, white people living in the North were.
Yeah.
So...
Mm-hmm. Like people in factories were just a number, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think it would have. They wouldn't have had all the like hate crime aspect. I guess I think it would have been diminished if they had freed them themselves. So I will say that, and I think that all ties into. So where did Lincoln go wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And I think he went wrong on a lot of fronts. I think he went wrong both in his political decisions that he did as president. I think he went wrong both in his military decisions, and then I also think he's just really, I don't understand where all this prestige that's attached to him comes from. And I'll go into it. So politically, first of all, for anybody who calls him the most American president, I don't get it, because I think I will say this, I am a realist. That's my IR thought process. And I think Lincoln was definitely a realist. All of his actions, totally quintessential of what a realist would do. Divide and conquer, basically, which is what he does. He uses the Emancipation Proclamation as a tool, both to give the slaves some sort of spirit, both give his men and the people at home some sort of like moral casus belli, and then also tell the foreign countries that are inclined to intervene to separate the North and the South, whoa, we don't want to get involved in a war that's clearly about slavery now, because they already had banned slavery, and that would have given them horrible dissent among their own people. So he's totally a realpolitik. I think he's definitely a realist. So I can respect him for that. But so if you're judging him on that basis, I think he's good, at least politically. Militarily, I still think he falls under the average. But anyway, the point is, you can't really if you call him like the ideal American president who really represents American values, I think that's just a horrible mistake, because he didn't.
Yeah.
I mean,
Copperheads. Then.
Beside, like, even more than that, though, like, in the border states, he used habeas corpus, suspended it. He suspended habeas corpus. In Maryland, he brutally repressed any efforts to join the South. Brutally took away people's rights, imprisoned a ton of people. Basically, like, there's people trying to run for like president and like mayor of Baltimore and stuff that were like pro-South, and if they would about to win, politically imprisoned by Lincoln. So you can say, yeah, that's what you have to do in war. We've never had another civil war, so there's nothing else to judge in. Obviously, civil wars are messy, but just you can't say he's an ideal American values president. Like, I mean, if he's suspending habeas corpus a lot, politically imprisoning people, that's just not a great fit to be called ideal American president. Additionally, like, politically, I mean, do you have any personal criticisms, or do you have any backlash to what I'm saying?
Not really. Like you mentioned, like you said that if you just look at it in the specific lens of, you know, an American president who upholds the Constitution and all that, like, obviously, you know, he in order to make sure that he did make sure his efforts in the war weren't stopped or harmed or any way, he would imprison people. So and even though I agree with those actions, in the realist sort of way, like, it just had to be done probably, at least it seemed like that. But yeah, I agree. Like it's not what an American president would have done. He isn't putting his principle or values first necessarily. He's just putting, it's very utilitarian, I say.
Well, yeah, and plus, like, the whole, like, Emancipation Proclamation, besides being totally a political tool, he
Yeah.
even stated himself before, when he campaigned, that he wasn't an abolitionist. He wasn't going to liberate the South. He just didn't want it to spread to the new territories. So, there's an element of, like, hypocrisy to that.
Yeah.
Furthermore, and this is the complaint that I can have for him, regardless if you want to, like, judge him by the ideal American president, or you just want to say, well, who cares about that? He was a great politician. He did what he had to do to win. Fine. Disregarding that, he was horrible at being a commander-in-chief of the military. The North had about 2/3 the resources, 2/3 the manpower compared to the South, 2/3.
You mean the South had 2/3 of the North, or?
No, of the pie, the North has 2/3.
Oh, I see.
And then, like, 2/3 of the cavalry, people don't even realize that because the South was so much better with the cavalry, but they had much less horses compared to the North. 2/3 of the artillery. Like, basically in everything, industrially, population-wise, the North had about 2/3 more, at least, in every category than the South. And it took them 4 years to take out this agrarian-based society. And, like, I just think that's, like, a complete failure. And, of course, you could say, well, he had a lot of bad generals.
Well, I mean, doesn't
he? You got to figure that out. That's part of the problem. And, Ulysses S. Grant, you'll say, well, Ulysses S. Grant did well. Well, he had to go through the long west battles, Shiloh and everything. Finally, Vicksburg when he takes out the Mississippi, and then he gets put finally against Lee to push in, and that's a long slog because Lee gets entrenched. You see a little bit of World War I future action with all the entrenchment battles. Like, it was just so inefficient, and I think Lincoln should have been better. He shouldn't have let McClellan stay in so long because McClellan was obviously just too hesitant. Some of those guys were just like Burnside, the charges he made when he just lost thousands of men and then didn't even win, let alone push an advantage. It was just horrible military decisions. And, I think that he should have seen what Grant was doing, put him on the eastern coast, and let him push against Lee earlier. Because, a lot of people say we had to use the Anaconda Plan, so you had to cut off the Mississippi, blockade them, and then slowly push in. I don't believe that. I think if you had rushed in within the first year, took Richmond, was moving down the coast, the eastern coast, which is basically where most of the South's money is anyway, and cities are. Maybe hit Georgia and then hit Atlanta after, like, sweeping it down like that. I think they would have been wiped out 1 or 2 years max.
Yeah, probably. Like you said, a bunch of men, just throw them at them. They're probably not organized at that point. And
that's what Grant did. Grant was no brilliant general. He just realized, well, these guys might be great generals. They might know how to fight and lose the least casualties. But, hell, I'll just keep throwing guys at them, and they're going to have to fall back. And, it worked, and eventually Lincoln saw that, and then eventually the war ended in 4 years. But I just think that was just a massive failure on his part.
Yeah. So I guess we should, since we're talking about like why Lincoln, obviously Lincoln had a bunch of problems, especially when it came to the military front. So like, why do you think he is held as such a high prestigious character? Like me personally, I think it's because well, he was obviously a great speaker. Like his speeches were fantastic.
Yeah.
And like in the speech where he basically said we should, you know, what was it called again? He like went to some bar or something. I can't believe I'm forgetting. But
I mean, either way,
you know, 50 years ago.
The Gettysburg Address.
Gettysburg Address. Yes, pardon me. You know, that's a fantastic speech. That's like that's not just an American thing. That's like looked on as all like English speakers around the world and said, you know, that's a fantastic, you know, short speech that did exactly what it was meant to do. And it really made, and of course it did rile some people, not rile people up in a bad way, but like, you know, rallied them. Mm-hmm. And I also think one of the big reasons people were able to overlook some of the problems he did is because, well, he was assassinated, the first president to be assassinated. And I noticed this a lot. Like you have someone who's like, you know, they did their job or whatever, they were okay. And I'm not just talking about politics, I'm talking about everything in general. But then they get assassinated, and then all of a sudden they're like the best. Like how many people would say Abraham Lincoln is the best president to have ever existed?
Most Americans.
I'd say most American, and George Washington would probably be second, because that's probably like...
It's one of the two.
Yeah, one of the two.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so I think, first of all, you made a great point about the assassination.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's definitely true. Especially when you look at who assassinated him, the really dramatic way it happened.
Yeah, it was like a stage play.
Because
he was an actor.
A stage play, but it was like almost a stage play, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great point. And, I mean, when we look at, like, JFK authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was horrible.
Horrible.
And then, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, yes, he did manage to come through with it, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yeah.
And it should have been settled earlier.
Yeah.
So
at the very least, he's like an okay president.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying he's a bad president. I'm not saying he's horrible. But, you know, I mean, he wasn't very moral, let's put it that way, in his personal life. And, you know, the fact that he's glorified, I mean, he cheated on his wife constantly. I mean, of course, that doesn't really affect who he is as a president, but the point is that he's glorified. I think a lot of people would say Kennedy's one of the best presidents.
I mean, there's that giant statue of him and Martin Luther King, like, reaching out to touch hands. I forget where exactly it is, but, like, it's a huge statue.
And Kennedy did almost nothing for civil rights.
Yeah,
for black people.
yeah.
And exactly. I think he's glorified, and it's because of the shocking way he was assassinated as well.
And also he happened to be a great speaker as well.
Yeah,
so.
And he did happen to be a great speaker as well. It is kind of interesting like that. I think that kind of goes back to an old phenomenon that you have with democracies, and that's the whole idea of a demagogue.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'd totally consider Lincoln a demagogue or Kennedy, but I do think just the ability to make people remember your speeches more than your actions kind of makes you look like more of a demagogue, you know, if your actions are overshadowed by just your speeches, you know. That's probably a negative thing. I mean, when you look at like people like Caesar, he had great speeches. He was great at fighting militarily and was also a pretty efficient leader.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so you don't really just remember one thing about him. I think that's what differentiates people, like real leaders, real politicians, real amazing statesmen from demagogue type people. So, but the biggest thing that makes Lincoln considered either the top president or like one of the top two is absolutely just the fact that he won the Civil War and the fact that he made the Emancipation Proclamation during it. Those are the two things that just no matter what are going to make him always up there, because people say he preserved the United States and he ended slavery. And, you know, of two things you could do to the United States, that's probably the best two that you can do.
Yeah, honestly.
From a PR perspective.
Yeah.
So, you know, people don't really care how he did it. People don't really care
how well he did
it. No one really cares about those details.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's ultimately why. And so, I mean, and like I said, I think he was a relatively good realpolitik. I think he was really good with realism.
Okay.
I think he definitely applied himself well. But overrated? I think a lot of presidents could have easily done what he did? Yes. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah. I didn't used to think like this, but, after, this before the podcast, of course, but after you told me like all those reasons, and I'm like, yeah, you've got a point. A huge point. Like, that's exactly what I thought. Like, he preserved the Union and he made the United States whole again and got rid of slavery. Those are, of course, things that are so huge that they overshadow how well they were done. And, just you kind of mentioning that, like, the North had so many advantages.
Yeah,
Just
I mean, if I'm playing like a pickup basketball game and I have on my team Shaq and LeBron James and you have 2 fifth graders, like, it doesn't really matter how good I am because I'm just going to have that inherent advantage of the people around me and the things around me that I'm going to probably win anyway.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if I could have been really good or really bad. Because all that really matters is that I won, and I'm going to win because of the things that are around me are better
that's
than
true.
what you have. You know? So I think it's kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
But, going back, I think the most interesting thing about all of this, though, is it's really weird that Trump brings this up in the first place. Because, a lot of people like to say that we, as the United States, are in another one of these periods, that we're coming up to a civil war again. Because of all this dissent. I mean, you hear this from some people.
You do.
You hear this from some people that kind of say that like everything's boiling down, that we're getting so divided. We've never been so divided as a country. And it's like, well, we were more divided as a country.
Yeah,
Let me
literally.
just say that. But I mean, maybe do you think so? I guess this is my question for you.
Okay.
Do you think there is any merit to somebody saying that we are becoming increasingly polarized both in the government and between citizens? It's kind of regional, Is there going to potentially be a civil war? Do you think there's any attention? At least, do you think there's any there's going to be more violent dissent? I mean, we already are seeing that with Antifa. We're already seeing that with other groups. We're already seeing some violence in like certain areas, clustered in certain areas, and it's not like necessarily fatal violence, but I mean, with all those factors, do you think there's any merit to that?
Honestly, no. Like you do bring up Antifa and stuff like that, but then again, they're just like a fringe thing. Like, I don't see people going, we need to secede, especially that sort of thing.
I mean, we did hear that after the election. California really wanted to secede. Well,
did they? Like, the thing about that though is like, these people who say these things, they're all talk, no action. Like that's just how it is. Especially in this modern age, like a lot of people, especially young people, aren't willing to vote. They're willing to protest, but not willing to vote. They're not willing to do anything that really makes a difference. And I think that's just what it comes down to. Like, people will more likely give a Facebook like than write on a ballot. That's just how it is these days. Now, I don't know, maybe if in the future voting becomes entirely electronic and is really easy to access, then maybe. But I still even don't think that would make a difference. I just don't think people want to deal with that. Like, imagine if California said, yeah, we are seceding. Like, even if you don't know anything about history or war or whatever, like that's some kind of, that sort of thing is bad. Like, if the United States says, no, you're not going to secede, and they send troops, well, then what are you going to do? Like, are you, like, personally the person who said we should secede while writing on Facebook that we should secede? Like, are you willing to take up arms? Probably not. Especially since California is, like, super gun-free zone. Then, like, what are they going to do?
Well, yeah, I think that's a whole nother question, but I think I think it is kind of important. I think it probably does overshadow this, the chance of anything happening, because the fact is, the U.S. military now, the federal government's military, there's no way that, unless the military itself fragmented significantly, if states seceded, there's no way anybody could really oppose the military in any meaningful way. I mean, there's also the whole like proliferation, I guess, of nukes among like states that would secede. That would also be a major problem. I mean, a lot of nukes are in the south, and a lot of them are in the north. So that would have a whole another dynamic.
wow.
So I agree. But I also think that you're right that there's like this social trend that like we express our like anger, we express like our intense feelings more on like Facebook posts than ever actually doing anything physically in real life.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the most important part of it all is that people aren't willing to do that. People aren't really willing to risk their lives. And most importantly, I don't think this honor of fighting for your individual state exists anymore.
Yeah, totally.
So
And
I don't see that happening either.
And also, you like to bring up the bread and circuses. Like people are so, even if things get really bad, people always have things to turn to. Like, it's not in like the old days where like you were a farmer and you were going to be a farmer and your son was going to be a farmer and your father was a farmer. Like, you aren't stuck in this sort of, this sort of predefined way of living. So like and you have more to, back then, like all they could really hinge upon was that, I may be a farmer, I may be poor, but at least I'm a Southerner or something like that.
Yeah.
They've got a stronger sense of identity where they live because they don't have these bread and circuses sort of thing. So.
No, I think that's a good point too. Yeah. I think we're about wrapped up on this topic.
Yeah, I'd say so.
This one is a little history heavy. Oh, sorry for that, guys. But, I thought I really got excited when I saw this on the news. I was kind of perplexed why it was even being talked about.
Yeah,
it's kind of odd. But, I thought we'd bring this up, that we'd have a little historical topic early on. Probably next we're going to do one on purely foreign policy.
Okay, sweet.
Maybe
even I don't know
Middle
what's going
East,
on.
maybe something in North Korea. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
But, we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed this. If you want to correct me or you want to...
Yeah, if we said anything wrong...
If you want to disagree with me, which
if you have any
plenty of room
contentions...
to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear it. Maybe I'll debate you in the comments. Maybe
that's what it's there for.
Somebody else will do it for me. But... Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yes.
Really trying to grow this channel.
We got like 35 views on our last podcast, and that's huge. That's like way more than we thought. It's not much, but it's something.
We haven't done much promoting, so if you like it, just at least just give it a like. We're not asking for a share. I mean, that'd be awesome.
Yeah,
but,
of course.
Just give us a like. Show us something you're appreciating it. Comment. Anyway, let us know.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, once again, thank you.